This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. This episode, I really want us to rethink where our source of quote-unquote allyship comes from. It's a word that has been used a lot, particularly in the past. Gosh, I keep referring to Black Lives Matter back in 2020, and that was 5 years ago. But, the past 5 years, it's been a huge engagement with social justice in its various forms, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's solidarity for Palestine, whether it's engaging with our current government, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum. There have been a lot of conversations around Indigenous rights, about equity, about poverty, and since our interest in social justice has increased, the word ally has been thrown around a lot. And I really want this episode to challenge you about where your sense of allyship comes from, because the way that I think about allyship, one thread of that should be understanding that a threat to justice or freedoms to anyone is the same threat to all of us, but then that means that we need to understand and unpack more what our connection to each other is, and acknowledging our interconnectedness. And so this episode, I really focus on othering. I hope it gives you a few nuggets to take away, and happy listening.
Welcome to Headscarves and Good Yarns with me, Amal Abdullahi. The show is all about talking about race, diversity, and everything in between, all in the hopes of empowering a more empathetic Aotearoa. We talk about all these huge life things through the lens of people's lives and stories. I hope every yarn you take a wee gem from it and expands your heart and mind just a wee bit more.
With this episode, I really, really wanted to focus on othering. When I think about allyship, I really think about how there is this sense of care that comes with allyship, and that care really comes from the idea that, if there is a threat to justice or to freedom to anyone in this community, then it's the same as threatening all of us. For me personally, anyway, that's where one of the core threads that my understanding and practice of allyship comes from. And so when you have that understanding of interconnectedness and that connection between all of us, even if actually your lives are quite different on the surface, that doesn't matter. It's not necessarily about feeling connected to those like us. The way that I'm framing this and thinking about this is that there is no sense of us, because if there's an idea of us, then there's this idea of them. And that's something that I really wanted to tackle in this episode today, the sense of us versus them. There's this sense of othering, and I think there are many different reasons why we don't feel connected to each other, and we don't and when we don't feel connected to each other, there is this level of disengagement, and I think this disengagement, it leads to a lot of unproductive tension, but I think this sense of othering is a really big way that we don't feel connected to each other. And just a disclaimer for this episode, by the way, this is not meant to attack anyone. I think everything that I'm about to say in this episode, it is so ingrained in our society that it's unconscious. It's just so ingrained into our society, and this is meant for and this episode is meant for an opportunity to reflect and to think about things deeper and in a critical manner as well, and think about, how all of this information kind of feeds into how you live your life currently. It is not meant to, rub your back and pat your shoulder if you're doing a great job, and it's not meant to shame you or guilt you if this is something that you haven't really thought about yet. That's not the point of this at all. This is an opportunity for everyone to tune in and to digest this and kind of see where this fits into their own lived experience, and to think about things and take this as an opportunity to think about things. I think I should probably just have this disclaimer for every single episode of the show, but for real though, I'm not trying to come for anyone's necks in this episode. It's so hopefully, even though we're not physically in this together while you're listening to this, this is me reaching out my hand saying, listen, I got you. This is not an attack. This is an opportunity for all of us to learn. So, Sodawo, welcome in Somali, and let's go. Let's do this together. So why did I want to do this episode in the first place? I feel like unfortunately, most of the inspirations for these episodes almost always comes from Facebook comment sections, because I read them and I scratch my head and I'm like, wow, there's a lot of loud people on here, just yappa-ing away, and I know that Facebook comment sections and stuff comment sections, it's only like a slice of the pie, but still, if that slice of the pie is publicly commenting things, there's equally, another slice of the pie where they might not voice it, but also think and feel the same way. And that's too many slices of the pie, in my opinion. And I think if that's what it is, then we need to sit down and talk about this. So there was a particular Facebook comment section that made me go, what? And it was about Chloe Swarbrick, Green Party co-leader, appealing to, the other MPs. I can't remember exactly what the legislature was about, but, it was about sanctioning the state of Israel. And this is on the back of Israel violating the ceasefire. And the Facebook comment section, it was a lot. First of all, there was a lot happening, but there was a lot of people commenting like, well, why don't you go to Gaza and help from there, and why are you focusing on issues that have nothing to do with New Zealand? We've got our own issues to deal with, like do something about that. And I was like, oh, okay. And then later in the day, I was just having a wee scroll, checking the news, and then I saw something on RNZ. So Far North Mayor, and I hope I'm not saying this incorrectly, but if I am, I'm very happy to be corrected. But Far North Mayor Moko Te Pānia just drew a hard line on racist comments, and set the precedent to delete them, straight up delete them, because the initial post was about inviting community groups to apply for funding for matariki events, and they didn't go into specifics as to what the comments said, but there was like a wave of very racist comments, and so they just Moko Te Pānia just said, listen, they're straight up getting deleted and blocked. Like, there's no space or room for this. And I know that these comments, it's not everyone, but it is a slice of our society if you think about it, and it's who knows how big the slice is, but the fact of the matter is that the slice still exists, and even if the slice is the minority, if nothing is done about it, it just allows it to continue to breed. Just last week was 6 years since the Christchurch terrorist attack, and even after all these years, thinking back on that day is very painful. But I also think, ooh, I just gave myself a bit of a list just then. But I also think, it's not just sadness and grief. There's anger as well, because, up until that point, the Muslim community was very vocal about the racist and ignorant hate the community received. And it always kind of fell on deaf ears. And that's the scary thing about all of this, is that, if it kind of goes unchecked, it just kind of grows. It just absolutely grows. And when I think about these Facebook comment sections, these responses, they come from, they happen for so many reasons, and they come from so many different sources. And I think that could be, an entire episode in itself about, the different sources for all of these different responses. And I don't want to say that these responses are invalid, because if you think about what's happening in this world and the change that we need to see, change elicits a lot of different responses. There's very human responses to change, including fear, including resistance. If you just kind of step away from all the social justice stuff, just think about in your own personal lives, sometimes change is welcomed, but even then it's not easy. Sometimes change is scary. Sometimes, you feel resistant to that change. And, that is a very human response. But I think when it comes to social justice, is that these fears or anxieties or these feelings towards change, we are experiencing them in the vacuum of our systems. And when we experience these feelings in the vacuum of our systems, these systems can then, it's no longer just a human emotion. The fear or the anxiety or the resistance is now socialized. It's not like our human response. And that's something that you can see a lot in the Facebook comment sections, because if you look at the comments and you think about the emotion that's underlying it, there is a lot of fear for change, a lot of anxieties, again, very human responses. But these emotions in the vacuum of these systems are socialized now. They are no longer just human emotions. These emotions are being experienced in the vacuum of our systems, and that can get us to feel or react or respond in a certain way, which I think is, it's interesting, isn't it? There was this quote by the Queen, Toni Morrison, which I think really captures the vibes, which is, the danger of sympathizing with a stranger is a possibility of becoming a stranger. I think it really highlights the sense of othering, or this us versus them. So before we really get into it, what actually is othering? And othering, I mean, yeah, there are so many different ways to pen this, but I think what othering overall does is that, you know, when there's a sense of othering kind of dictates who is seen as a full member of society. And so then there's us, who is seen as the, you know, full member of society, and not just only a full member of society, somewhere like whoever is grouped as us is seen for their full humanity as well. And then there's them, who are not seen as full members of society, who are not seen for their full humanity. And then when it's this idea of us versus them, well, then them poses a threat. And it's not just a simple idea of, like, you know, who we like versus we don't like. It's actually a sense of it's a sense of, you know, who is a full member of society, who is seen for their full humanity. And if you're not seen as a full member of society, or if you're not seen for your full humanity, then you're part of them. And them is scary because they pose a threat. And then there's imagined otherness, and it adds this extra thing to the them group, which is that people who are part of, or communities who are part of the them group, hold beliefs about the world that are fundamentally different from the, you know, quote unquote normal worldview. And the normal worldview is the ideal, right? And when you think about, you know, so now that we have this definition of othering to kind of understand and play with, you can see how when, like, this sense of othering can really alienate each other, or alienate us from each other, and kind of create this distance and create this sense of disengagement. And I really want to go back to the Queen Tony's quote here, now that we have like an understanding of what othering is that the danger of sympathizing with the stranger is the possibility of becoming a stranger. Woo. That's scary, isn't it? If we haven't had the chance to really unpack our sense of othering and how it impacts our lives. And the thing with othering is that it is so built into our systems. It's like the project of our system, our systems of privilege, our systems of, you know, capitalism, of white supremacy. Like, this sense of othering is so built into our systems. It's not obvious. It's the way that it's so built into the way that our system operates. Like, it's not until you have the chance to unpack it for yourself can you see the impacts of how it shapes your worldview. You know, and I can only ever speak for myself really on the show, and I didn't realize maybe until the age of I would honestly have to really say that I didn't sink my teeth into it until the age of 21 or 22, how much othering had been built into my understanding of the world, how much it had been built into my lens in which I viewed the world through. it's absolutely insane because, maybe, well, I get this is what I'm thinking. I can't assume what you're thinking, but, when I think back and there's a part of me that's like, but girl, you're like a black hijabi woman. Like, how did you not really understand that? Especially because if you think about the systems that exist, most of the time, I'm in the them group, you know what I'm saying? But you have to understand that, like, okay, yes, there are some identities that I have that where I don't necessarily have the privilege, or I have been othered. There are other privileges or identities that I have where the othering still was just so built into how I think about the world. I grew up here in Aotearoa. There are other ways that I have this sense of privilege where, intersectionality, y'all, is important, that I just didn't really understand how othering had been built into the way that I view the world. And again, this is not to show people that there is a moral failure here. It's to show that it's just so built in how we understand and see the world. And, I could spend so long talking about how othering is really built into our system, but for today's episode, just for an example, I'm going to get into what characteristics of white supremacy really foster the sense of othering. And there's this amazing work done by Tema Okun, and again, I hope I've said that correctly. And what Tema Okun did was kind of outline the characteristics of white supremacy. And I think, there's a lot of characteristics, but I've just picked out the ones that really feed the sense of othering. And these characteristics, I think, are really helpful because you're able to identify different parts of the culture, right? And when you're able to identify, it's a lot easier to unpick and to understand. And if you wanted to get into the rest of the characteristics, Google characteristics of white supremacy, Tema Okun. Absolutely, it's amazing to see the characteristics just written in black and white. It's easier to, because when it's broken down that way, I think it's, once you have that identification, it's a lot easier to start to unpack and to understand and digest. But yeah, I've just picked out 3 characteristics that really foster this fear of, that really foster othering, sorry. And I just want to quickly just go back to what I was saying before about very valid human responses, right? But these human responses being experienced in a vacuum of our systems, which if it's something that we are unaware of or is left unchecked, then, our human responses can then be socialized. And I think one of those emotions is fear. In white supremacy culture, the number one thing or strategy is to make all of us afraid. There's the fear of not being good enough, not being enough, and so whenever we are afraid, whatever the reason may be, lots of reasons to be afraid, especially So, whenever we are afraid, and this is really susceptible, especially when we don't have the skills to hold that fear, that is very easy to be manipulated by a false or powerful sense of safety. And, it's promised safety that's not necessarily actually comforting, because it's what it's based on is an abuse or misuse of power that can show up in so many different ways, whether it's microaggressions, whether, it's deadly violence directed at, whoever or whatever we are told to be afraid of. There's a lot of fear, and what this fear can do is disconnect us overall. It can disconnect us from each other, whether it's, racial identity or religion, or, there are so many ways that we can be disconnected to each other. It can disconnect us from ourselves. It can disconnect us from even within our own, racial groups. It can disconnect us from, not everyone is religious. I totally understand that, but it can disconnect us from our creativity, or from, if you're religious, your God, or whatever, the universe or the wisdom, whatever it is. And when you use fear as a strategy, it's very easy to separate people, because you're dividing and conquering, right? And so not only does it, it teaches us to fear others, and that fear can come up in unspoken ways. It can come up in very obvious ways. It can come up in Facebook comment sections. It's fear that makes it very easy to point the finger at those who are not us. This fear is, very much fosters a sense of us, or feeds into this idea of us versus them, because there's this belongingness with those that are included in us, and fear those who are not. And it's this, it sounds insane to say this out loud, but it's this fear that is a really big part of white supremacy. And the scariest thing about all of this, is your sense of fear being manipulated, and this fear, directly feeding this sense of us versus them. Because if there is that disconnection, it's very easy to not humanize them, and it's very easy to show violence to them, whether, and there's a scale of violence, leading up to microaggressions and ignorant comments, and on the other end of the spectrum, violence. There's this direct sense of othering there that comes from the fear. And I think to combat that fear, it takes a lot. There needs to be this sense of responsibility and emotional maturity and a sense of community, right? Because with community, there comes support and mutual accountability. And it's not easy. This is hard work, but it's necessary work that needs to be done. And I think the answer almost always lies with community, right? Because when you have community, you have a group of people that you can sit with your fear, you can name it, and you have accountability and support to understand that fear should not drive our beliefs and actions and decisions, and it shouldn't feed into the sense of othering. Another characteristic of white supremacy culture that I think that really feeds into the sense of othering is the right to comfort and fear of conflict. And so this characteristic really hones in on the cultural assumption that, I or we or us have the right to comfort, which means there is a zero tolerance for conflict. And so because there's this right to comfort, there's an assumption that goes with that, and that assumption, supports the tendency to blame the person or the group causing the discomfort or discomfort rather than addressing the issues being named. And that's something that you see a lot. You see a lot of that. And again, that really feeds this idea of us versus them, because it's never us. It's them that is to blame for the discomfort or the conflict or, whatever it may be. And so there are many ways that this right to comfort shows up as, which is, the belief that the us group or those with the power privilege have a right to emotional and psychological comfort. And another way that the right to comfort shows up is that those who are perceived to cause the discomfort are the scapegoats. So targeting and isolating those who are the scapegoats, rather than, actually calling the problem for what it is. For example, if it's racism, rather than addressing the actual racism, it's much easier to target and isolate those who are considered the them group. Another way that the right to comfort shows up is demanding or requiring or expecting apologies, or a version of "I didn't mean it" when faced with accusations of racism. Another way that it shows up is feeling entitled to name what is and isn't racism. Another way that the right to comfort shows up is those communities with the power and the privilege equating individual acts of unfairness with systemic racism or other forms of oppression. And I think that is really interesting. You can see how that characteristic really feeds into a sense of othering, and how if that's embedded into our system, how that further feeds that sense of othering as well. And not only is it the right to comfort, but it's that fear of conflict that works in conjunction with the right to comfort. And the fear of conflict shows up in many ways. For example, people in power being scared of conflict and trying to ignore it or run from it. When someone raises an issue that causes discomfort, the response is to blame the person for raising the issue rather than looking at the issue for what it is. Another way that the fear of conflict shows up is there's this really strange emphasis on being polite or setting the rules for how ideas or information or opinions need to be expressed. And I see this quite a lot when oppressed groups are kind of tone policed and asked to talk about things in a respectable manner, which that is strange to me. It's like you won't be heard if you don't communicate this in a respectable manner, and it's like invalidating their experience. Like if you're part of an oppressed group, you're not always going to speak lightly about that oppression. There will be anger there, but I do see a lot of tone policing, especially when it comes to Black communities. There's a lot of tone policing. Another way that this fear of conflict shows up, and it kind of goes hand in hand with what I was saying before, but equating the raising of difficult issues with being rude or out of line, and that just punishes people for speaking their truth and experience. Another way that this shows up is labeling emotion as irrational or as not intellectual. And that really undermines the importance of emotional intelligence. But you do see that a lot, particularly now that there's this really, I feel like it's unproductive, binary between the left and the right, and how both sides are kind of characterized. You can see how, the left is kind of characterized as being just angry lefties. It's strange. It is very, very strange. And then another characteristic of white supremacy culture that I think that really feeds into the sense of othering is individualism. And it's this idea that, that we make it on our own without help while pulling ourselves up by ourselves. And I think the key way that this individualism really feeds into othering is that when we have this cultural attachment to individualism, it leads to this, it leads to this denial of our very important and very essential interdependence. And, really, if we think about our interdependence, it's this idea that we're literally all in this together. But if we are living in a system and in a culture that actually encourages this sense of individualism, then there's no way for both of those things to be true at the same time. And so most of the time we're just denying the fact that there is this inherent interdependence for each other. I think if we were to understand like culturally and systematically that we are interdependent on each other, I really don't think that othering would exist. I don't think there'd be this sense of us versus them, because listen, y'all, we're all in this together. And when we're in it together, there's no idea of strangers. But yes, this individualism is pretty scary, because, you know, the way that it shows up is like every person for themselves. And another way that it shows up is that it fails to acknowledge how, you know, as I was saying before, intersectionality. There are so many different ways or things or communities or identities that make up who we are. But because of individualism, it's really, there's a failure to acknowledge that any other ways of being, you know, whether it be gender or sexuality or class or religion or able-bodiedness or age or education, help inform a belongingness to a dominant group. And it's this dominant group, the us, that kind of shapes cultural norms and behavior. And then for communities that are often not included in this sense of us and often labelled as them, individualism forces the quote-unquote them community to be in this bind, because, you know, we're not, you know, communities that are identified as them are accused of not being team players, you know. So if you think about it, there's punishments or repercussions for acting as an individual if and when it threatens the team. And then for those who are considered as the like us group, the culture focuses on whether an individual, you know, the individual's behavior, is seen as racist or not, is so focused on the person while ignoring the cultural, institutional, and systemic racism. You know, like most people might focus on the individual and be like, well, actually, now you're not being racist, or, you know, there are other systems of oppression. You're not being, you know, somethingist. While the exact conditioning is relentless and unavoidable, I feel like this way of living is very isolating and very lonely, but you can see how that then feeds into this, like, there's something that I need to get right, and it kind of implies that there only is one right way to do it. And again, that kind of feeds into this fear that I was talking about before. It's a lot. And so one thing that I do want to say about the sense of othering is also very nuanced. Again, you know, we don't live life, well, most of the time we don't live life with just the one identity. There are so many identities that make up who we are, and because the way that our privilege or lack thereof is shows up in the world, you know, very much depends on the context, right? You know, there are some rooms where I walk in and I don't really have a lot of privilege, but there are some rooms where I walk in and I do. And so this idea of othering is nuanced as well. Whoever us versus them is, it depends on the context at hand, right? But you can see how othering really breeds this idea of disconnect. And when I think there's this idea of disconnect, there is no sense of like we're kind of in this together. And, if you think about how, othering has always kind of shown up. But I think in particular, the Trump effect, really, ever since that man has come back into the White House, you can see how othering has been, comes into play. Like a homeboy is pretty direct with his sense of othering. I feel like usually othering is so subtle that it's just like built into our systems, and it's built into the way that we think about this world. Like, it takes a lot to really like notice it and to unpack it. But the thing with Trump is that he's Mans is very upfront about it, calling Mexicans rapists and drug dealers. And so when you use language like that, it's very obvious that it's like Americans versus Mexicans. And when there is a sense of othering, now it's much easier to deport people. And then that sense of othering is even like furthermore cemented physically with the idea of some kind of wall. So, the language that Trump uses, it's very much spelling out us versus them. Homeboy's wild. And I think that emboldens people to be even more explicit. And this kind of language, not only does it embolden people, it further conditions people's emotions. Like now there is this fear about undocumented people. And while I was doing research for this episode, I was reading the story, and this woman was saying, my father has gone to this restaurant for so long now, literally a regular, like knows everyone there. And he's been going there for so long. But since Trump has come back into the White House, he, is now questioning and assuming, who is documented versus undocumented, and, talking about how they shouldn't be here when, pre-Trump, it was just, that was just my father's favorite front of house staff that he engaged with for the day. You know what I mean? Like, it's insane, this sense of fear, and this us versus them has become like the divide has been cemented even more because the Trump administration is now requiring all non-citizens in the United States who are present for more than 30 days to register with the government and provide fingerprints. And the failure to do so can lead to the initiation of deportation proceedings. And this is under the Alien Registration Act, which has been established law in America for a hot minute, but it actually is generally not enforced. And the last time it was enforced was immediately after 9/11. Again, a time of strong human emotions, and I feel like now there is a lot of fear around migrants, and let's be real, not migrants of color, if we're really wanting to be real around here. And I always try to be honest on Headscarves and Good Yarns. And they're coming for people who are legal visa holders. They recently came for green card holder Mahmoud Khalil, and they're a student activist who is currently in detention, even though they have a green card. There was just a sudden appearance of men who weren't in uniform, and they refused to identify themselves, and they just took him away in front of his crying wife. Is a bit scary. And so I really think that we need to look at our sense of othering. I think when we have that connectedness with each other, I think the way that we tackle conversations, whether it's things that are happening here in our backyard or it's things happening overseas, we will be able to see that we are actually all connected together. And I think when you have that sense of connectedness, your allyship changes, and that impacts the actions that come from that. And so I think it's fostering this sense of belongingness and fostering this sense of humanizing everyone and really challenging those negative representations and stereotypes and really trying to be careful of language that is dehumanizing. But thank you for tuning into this episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. I hope you have some golden nuggets to take away, and we'll catch you for the next one.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.